If the economic impact of Brexit is so difficult to predict, should we base our referendum vote on moral principles?
And moral principles, you mean anything but economics, really?
Yeah, so something like, say, solidarity amongst the other nations that are in the EU that depend on us and for our involvement in the EU.
Okay. So, Nigel Lawson, I don't know, you agree with the first part. The economic impact is so difficult to predict, so other ideas are going to decide how people vote, or should.
I think the economic impact of Brexit will be positive, but I agree that it is difficult to predict how positive it will be. And I agree with you that it is fundamentally a political issue because the European Union is a political venture. The whole purpose of the European Union is to create a United States of Europe. I am not at all hostile to Europe as such. I live in France and I love it there. But this is not about whether you like Europe or not, or whether you like travelling in Europe. It's whether you want to be part of a United States of Europe. And I think most of the people of Europe don't, and certainly the people in France, I know well they don't, and they're extremely disaffected with the European Union at the present time, but their elites want it. Jacques Delors, I knew very well, that was his whole purpose. And the British certainly don't want it. Not even the British elite want it. So therefore there is no point in being a member of an undemocratic outfit which has an objective which you don't share. So we should love them and leave them.
Even though you can... All right. Michael O'Leary.
I couldn't disagree more profoundly with Nigel. He's just fundamentally wrong. Leaving the European Union will be damaging to the UK economy. I say that as one of the bigger foreign inward investors in the UK. Ryanair employs over 3,000 people here in the UK. We will invest less in the UK if the UK leaves the European Union. It will undoubtedly damage sterling. It will undoubtedly damage your economic growth, certainly for the next 3 to 5 years. And yet, leaving, the Leave campaign's only argument is that if you leave, it will all stay the same. Well, it won't. It'll only stay the same if you can go then and renegotiate re-entry into a single market, which is basically Norway. Welcome to Norway. What Norway does is it's not in the European Union, but it has negotiated membership of the single market, which, to be fair, the vast majority of the UK people wish to remain in. Norway pays something like the same or slightly more per head of population to the European Union, despite not being a member, and it has to obey about 95% of the regulations coming out of Brussels. So you're being sold a lie by people who tell you if you leave, it will all stay the same. It won't. You should stay, and like Nigel's previous government under Mrs Thatcher, you should help to reform the European Union from within. And to be fair to David Cameron, I think he's done a good job.
But what do you say to the point Nigel Lawson made about that everybody else wants something different from what Britain wants, which is a United States of Europe?
Speaking as somebody who's Irish, what I want is pretty much what most people in the UK want. I want a single market. I want a single market where you're free to move around, where there's less regulation, where there's less bureaucracy. David Cameron has negotiated reforms which protects sterling from the European Union, protects the UK taxpayer from funding out any other euro bailouts, and protects the UK from closer European integration. Nigel is simply wrong in his analysis.
No,
it is true.
That is not true.
We'll come back to that point. The woman there in the second row from the back.
I'd also disagree with Nigel because, personally, I do need to stay part of the EU to get a free education. My country has failed me and I'm having to move to Sweden to get a free education at university. So it will affect people and people do not want it to happen. OK.
And you, sir, over there in yellow. Yes.
Some people would regard democracy as more important than an extra few quid by doing the trade deals that we supposedly won't get.
OK. And you down here.
Mr Leary, I think you skipped the point. The problem that we have with the Remain campaign, you're not running a positive campaign. All we hear every other day is scare stories, or there's going to be an apocalypse if we leave and we'll lose 6% of GDP by 2030. Why is it there's no positive campaign? Now, fair enough, granted, Brexit is running a scare campaign as well, but if you want people to buy into the EU, to be part of it, to reform it, then you need to run a positive campaign, not try to scare the living hell out of us.
OK, I'll come back to you. Let's go around the panel. Isabel Oaktree.
Well, Michael, I can well understand why you want to stay in the EU, because the EU works very well for enormous companies like yours. It's very different if you run a small business where you find that the EU, you have to comply with the same set of regulations as a huge company like yours, and you are effectively strangulated by the regulation and all the red tape. So I think it's, you know, the small businesses, they are the backbone of our economy. And I think that the economic debate around Brexit has been characterised by the most deplorable scaremongering on the part of both the government and the Remain campaigners. We don't know what the economic impact is going to be, but it's not going to be an apocalypse. And, you know, for many people, as the gentleman up there said, this isn't about a few quid here or there. It is about our sovereignty and our ability to control our borders and how many people we have coming here.
Listen, Andy.
Well, I don't think it's scaremongering to point out that Europe is by far our biggest export market, that if you look at a whole host of voices from our government to financial experts to the President of the United States, they've all pointed out that there would be serious problems for Britain if we came out. And I don't think that is scaremongering, but I do take the point that this gentleman made about the positive case for Europe. And I think there is a positive, a moral case for Europe, a case that says there is another Europe, a Europe that has been a forum for solidarity of working people in countries across Europe, that has won and protected us rights at work like paternity leave and maternity leave, and the right to challenge employers, and health and safety laws that have actually kept some of my constituents in Wigan alive as a result. And I think there's another Europe as well, the sort of Europe that helps us to deal with the major challenges that we in Britain face, whether it's the mass movement of people, whether it's global terrorism, or whether it's climate change. You know, just a few months ago, the fact that we were able to work with the rest of the European Union to tackle climate change didn't just help to raise our ambition in Britain, it helped to raise Europe's ambition, and it helped to raise the world's ambition. And that's why I think we're better off in Europe.
What you said to the point that Nigel Lawson made, that these other states want a United States of Europe, and we don't, and therefore should get out.
Well, I just think that you know, we've heard a lot from the other side about how everything will be fine when we leave the European Union. We'll be able to trade with other nations, negotiate our own deals. But then you have the President of the United States who comes over and says, well, actually, no, that's not true. So I just think...
No, but that wasn't the point he was making. He was making the point that this was going to become a United States of Europe, which we didn't want. That's your point.
Well, I think what we've seen over the last few years, actually, is that we get to make decisions about some of those really important issues. Right. So, for example, Isabel talks about unrestricted immigration. We are currently having a row in the UK about whether we can stand up and take just 3,000 of the 90,000 displaced children fleeing war in Syria that are currently in Europe. If that tells you anything, it tells you that we have the power to control our own borders if we can't even be bothered to take such a small number of children.
What I'd like to do, hang on, what I'd like to do is hear from one or two more members of the audience. I'm leaving Benjamin Zephyr on the side for the moment because I know he says he's no idea how he's going to vote. So I thought he could listen to all the arguments and then we can hear whether you've decided. But hold on just a second. The man there in the blue shirt.
If we were to leave the EU, would it be the end of cheap flights from Europe to destinations? And would we impose a levy on British flights to Europe?
OK, well, we'll hold on to that one. I'll make a note of that. You, sir, here. In the second, yes.
I think the point that Brexit saying there'll be everything fine, no change, is not right. I think a lot of people are recognising that there will be possibly a dip in various economic things, but it'll come back later. And I don't think Obama actually said anything terrible. If you listen to what he said, he was talking in terms of a US deal being negotiated at the moment, and they'll do that first and we'll be after that. That's no biggie.
And you there, and the woman there, yes.
I think if we're going to talk about the morality and democracy within the EU, I think we have to look at the way that they've treated Greece and the way that they've held them hostage with the bailouts.
Benjamin Zephaniah.
Well, I'm still undecided.
You haven't got that long, you know.
I know. And
49 days, is it, or 48? I can't remember where we are now. How many days is it?
It's interesting. I was going to say until Lisa spoke
50.
that nobody actually really addressed the question. It was about ethics and morals. Everybody talked about economics, apart from Lisa.
Well, we talked about politics to some extent.
Well, the question was about morals and ethics, as far as I remember.
Well, the question, well, Finlay can say what the question was again, but it was it was saying the economics are difficult to predict one way or the other, and therefore it's about other issues. That's right, Finlay, isn't it, roughly?
And I think mass disagreement on the panel just demonstrates how difficult it is to predict amongst people who are qualified and able to predict it.
Yes, and I'm completely unqualified, but I'm passionate about it. Now, this may sound like a strange thing to say in this arena, and I can understand a lot of people not understanding this, but I believe in a USA. I believe in the United States of Africa. I believe in the United States of Asia. I believe in the United Arab States. States getting together and working for the betterment of their people, not becoming a kind of European superstate, as some people are not keen on, but just, I've been in Africa and wanted to get from one country to another, and I have to fly to another European country before I can do it, because these countries are not talking to each other. So at the heart of me, I like the idea of countries coming together and working together. I remember when I was a kid and it was the common market, that's what it seemed to be about. And I also am very keen on having the politicians that I elect very close to me. So you see my confusion here.
You are. No, you've got a problem.
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah. But I've looked at all the kind of, as much as I can, the kind of economic arguments and all that. And what it boils down to for me is how it affects people on the street. And from what I understand, if it wasn't for the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU and lots of other European courts, a lot of black people wouldn't have got their rights in this country. A lot of women, a lot of working people wouldn't have their rights. And we couldn't rely on the Tories or Tony Blair to give them to us.
Nigel. I don't think Benjamin is right. We have had a legal system which has protected rights, human rights, for years and generations. It's got nothing whatever to do with the European Union.
Are we trying to drop out of a human rights?
Nothing whatever to do with the European Union. On the economics, Isabel is absolutely right that the regulation, that there is the excessive regulation, the excessive red tape, is strangling small and medium-sized enterprises.
And yet
but this is overall. No, they don't.
No, they don't.
They
That's
don't.
just inaccurate.
It's the big boys, it's the CBI and the banks and all these big boys who do. It is not the small companies. They're opposed to it. But it is not at heart an economic issue. It is whether you believe in democracy, whether you believe in self-government. And as for cooperation, cooperation in the modern world needs to be global. The idea that cooperation should just be within Europe is crazy, it's crackers. We do have wonderful cooperation through the Commonwealth, through the membership of the Security Council of the United Nations, through the so-called Five Eyes security system which we have with the United States, Canada, New Zealand and Australia, through NATO, which is very important for our defence. It is that which is important. But our own borders are important too, and we do not have control, despite what Lisa said, we simply do not have control over our own borders.
Nigel,
let me finish the sentence. Anybody who has a European Union passport has the right to come here, live here and work here. And there's nothing we can do about it. And this is going to be extended to 75 million Turks. That's on
but Nigel, you don't mind going to France?
And
it's not.
This is completely...
But you don't mind going to France?
No.
This is the sort of misinformation that is really putting people off this campaign.
It's true.
Yeah, that's rubbish.
All right.